In November, David Kramer, the founder of Sentry, wrote, "Gotta admire the never-ending passion from Mitchell Hashimoto on whatever he builds." Mitchell is today's guest. He's the founder of HashiCorp. HashiCorp went public in November 2021. But today's episode is not really about HashiCorp. Today's episode is primarily about Ghosty, the open source terminal emulator that Mitchell is building. We talk about designing dev tools.
I would tell all dev tool founders to chase that human experience.
About building challenging technical projects.
To me, I've taken the opposite approach, which is I look at something like a web browser and I think it's made by people. I'm people, so I could do it.
Open source sustainability.
And I think that bar is so high. I think that for a lot of open source projects, having at least some compensation for time is more realistic.
Passion and hiring.
In any category, again, I would hire the person that's overly obsessed with a topic over anybody else any day of the week.
And using AI as a developer.
I think it's extremely suspicious when any software engineer says, "Oh, I don't use AI tooling."
I think that Mitchell is just a kind of walking, living, coding reminder that your passions really, really do matter and they can take you really far. It was actually just before the call. I didn't realize that you'd written. I discovered this other article that you'd written about like new normals.
Long time ago.
It's like actually like a really good article that like it was. You wrote it a long time ago as well.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I wrote that. I was like 21 or something. I mean, yeah, I was just like I wrote that because I was in a space where I was just kind of looking around and kind of shocked at what I was getting into. But at the same time realizing that everyone around me was sort of doing the same thing. But when I went home and saw peers my age at the time, it was very unusual what I was getting into, and it just made me realize sort of the importance of the people that surround you.
Yeah, and I think you started off, it was like when you were a kid and you started working on games, like was it like cheats and stuff from games and things like that, right?
That's right.
And that was like your new normal because suddenly you were doing that for like, you were like coding for like 2 hours a day. Yeah. So I guess like what it's kind of going was like, I was curious about what the new normals are for you now. Cause there was like, you found your new normal of like, there's startups and it's normal to do a startup. But then, this was right before, I'm kind of curious about what your new normals are now.
It's a great question. No one's really asked that. So I have to think about it a little bit. I mean, I think for me, my new normal really is around family. I really feel like I'm really, I had my first kid, and I feel like my primary day-to-day job is just being a dad. And I think that that's normal for me. And the work that I do now, whether it's, my fun projects like Ghosty or some of the investing or advising I do or philanthropy or volunteer work, like I think all that stuff is sort of just secondary, right? Like it's, which is not normal, I would say, in general. Like there's not a lot of peers that I have that are in that same situation. But yeah, the real grounding thing for me is probably the parenting.
Do you think that sorry, that it goes very off topic, I guess, in there, but like I was going to ask, like, do you think you would have got to that anyway, like without the startup success? Or
well, I think the mechanics of it all would have been very different because I'm in a position right now where I don't have to work full time, and so I think that's a significant difference. So I'm sure I would have loved parenting, and I would have found that to be the most important thing in my life, regardless of what ended up happening. But the sort of, like I said, the mechanics of it are different. And I think that's different enough that it changes my outlook on things.
This episode is brought to you by WorkOS. If you're building a dev tool, at some point your customers are going to start asking you for enterprise features. WorkOS offers you single sign-on, skim provisioning, and audit logs out the box. WorkOS is trusted by Perplexity and Vercel, as well as Workbrew, a homebrew management startup that I recently interviewed. I just told Mike that WorkOS is the sponsor, and this is what Mike said.
Yeah, so WorkOS isn't paying me any money for this. I pay WorkOS money for this, but WorkOS is like one of the best developer tools I've like ever used. It's the documentation and the experience with building with them is so good. Like I initially was almost like, okay, this seems expensive, but then I built an integration with them in about 20 minutes that I had spent 2 days bang my head off the wall trying to build it directly with Okta. And then with WorkOS, I then have like many SSO providers like supported instead of just one. So yeah, like for me, WorkOS is one of the nicest developer experiences I've encountered in the last like 5 years, probably. And it's not surprising because a bunch of the developer team are ex-GitHub and therefore very good at their job.
Go to workos.com to learn more. And it's kind of interesting as well because like even you talk about the secondary stuff, but with your projects, there's something different about, I don't know what it is, but it's like almost like, and I know I'm not alone here because like I see people talk about this on Twitter and stuff, like David Kramer talking about like your passion for actual like building stuff is just somehow fascinating and also like uplifting and I don't know, it's kind of inspiring.
Thanks. I think, you know, I think I'm very genuine about my passion about building. I think you know, you don't need to believe me. I think you could just see that in the work that I do. But I think there are a lot of people out there that I don't know, it feels like they act passionate about something and then, you know, circumstances change or, you know, they make a lot of money or something. And then you realize they were just saying that to get to that point. And it's fine. That's fine. I just think that I'm the type of person that wasn't the case, right? Like I think I got lucky in a lot of ways and I'm thankful for that. But my driving force through before tech, through college was I always just chased my passion. And that thankfully worked out well for me. But I think even if if my startup career didn't end up being as successful as it was, I think I would still be working for companies where I was having the most fun. I mean, I think that I've always optimized for that. So that's,
I guess it's like, there's probably an incentive, isn't there? I suppose like to people, there's this knowledge that passionate engineers are like better engineers and probably have more style of success. So I suppose there's a reason to kind of like
maybe
be perceived as that person, even if you're not.
Maybe I think for sure that hiring passionate people in any category, not just tech, is always like better. And I tweeted about this like, I don't know, last year sometime because it happened I was fixing a garage door on my house and it kept breaking. I don't know why, you know, we don't need to get into it. It kept breaking. And I finally found this garage door guy that came over and I had a newborn was crying because it was a year ago. Newborn was crying. Newborn had to be fed. And I had this garage guy come over and he would not stop talking to me about garages, not about my garage, just the garages in general. He was just like going on and on about this spring and this type of motor and this thing. And I, you know, eventually I was listening to be polite, but I really had to go because my baby was crying. And so finally I was like, I'm so sorry, I have to go. But in my mind, I was like, man, this guy really loves garage doors. And so I know he's going to do a good job. And he did a great job. And I would use him again. And so I think that applies. I tweeted about that incident, but I think that applies to everything.
Yeah.
And even when I was an employer, I felt like if you find, you know, there are people that say that it's not fair to expect someone to have a GitHub resume or something because work-life balance and different life circumstances. And that's totally true. But it's also true that if you find someone that has the time and makes the time to do that stuff, that they are likely better. And, you know, it's unfair because life circumstances have given someone a better chance of being better. But like, that's just what I've practically seen throughout everything in my life. I would hire in any category, again, I would hire the person that's overly obsessed with a topic over anybody else any day of the week.
Yeah, that it makes total sense. And would you say that maybe you are like the garage door? You are a garage door guy, but you were just lucky that your garage door was like a very crucial thing.
I am for sure in different topics, but I got lucky that in that metaphor, my garage door happened to be something that turned into a big industry because okay, my obsession, right? Like we could take it back to like 2010ish. My obsession was a mixture of automation and infrastructure. Like that was my obsession. And we were in a time where that wasn't actually that interesting. The cloud wasn't taken very seriously. Existing automation tooling that was venture backed was not successful in the eyes of venture capitalists. And so I've said this before, but like my time at HashiCorp, we had a really tough time raising our first couple venture rounds because it was not a good looking company. We didn't have a business plan. We had this open source that was popular but didn't make any money. We were remote, we were open source, we were doing infrastructure, we were doing cloud. Like all these things were not cool. And we basically got saved because of Docker, I would say. Docker hyped up the entire industry like overnight. But I just got really lucky. Like I think I would have done infrastructure automation as long as I could have regardless of if it blew up. Like I just got lucky that did end up being something that blew up.
Why do you think you got so kind of passionate about it? Is it something that you've kind of thought about, like where it came from?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, so the automation part, I think that's the common thread throughout my programming life, whether it's career or hobby. I've always loved automating things. So that one is there. But the infrastructure side, I think there was, to me, what originally got me into it, there was this element of sort of mystery around it. The first job that I had, we had, I don't know, a dozen web programmers. Like that's how I started, was Rails. So I was doing Rails, and we had like a dozen Rails people, and we had like one guy sitting in the corner, on his ThinkPad using Linux, long hair, only wore black, and he did all our infrastructure, and he wouldn't talk to anybody. And I was like 18 or 19 at the time, and I remember just being curious, like, what does that guy do? And like, we give him stuff to just put up, and he fixes problems, and like, how does it work? And I think to add to the mystery, I was using a Mac, and I would watch his screen sometimes, and I had no idea what was going on because he is a tiling window manager, and he was in the terminal all the time, and it just seemed like for me as an 18, 19-year-old kid, seemed like magic. And so that pulled me into infrastructure, and then my interest thereafter was sort of humanizing infrastructure. Was like, let's make this not so scary for people, and make it not as like mysterious. And so I think that's what got me into it.
Yeah, and on that kind of like making it human, I feel like you've got quite a few different approaches to building products for developers that I've not heard many people talk about. So for instance, you've mentioned about how you would kind of create fake kind of like terminal experiences and like do sleeps and stuff like that. Could you talk about some of the methods that you use there? Well,
I think taking a step back, I think it is very important. Like I said, in my job, I like to have fun. I think that using tooling, whether in your career or anything, should also be somewhat enjoyable. I don't always say fun because a lot of people don't like doing this stuff, but at least it should be somewhat enjoyable. And so to that end, the ultimate benchmark for me is the human reaction to using a tool. Everything else is a means to that end to me. So performance, design, functionality, all of that only matters to make the human operator happy, in my mind. Even functionality, is it bug free? Like I think that I think most engineers would say being bug free is important. And I would say it's only important if the person doesn't hit the bugs. Right. Like if they're using the software and it works for their use case and there's bugs, but they never hit the bugs, like who cares? That I don't think the perfection of software is that important to me. It's the impossible goal of having a perfect human experience with software that's interesting to me. There's another sort of concrete example there, which happens a lot with the current work that I'm doing with the terminal, is people get really caught up in numbers when it comes to performance. And obviously you can measure performance in certain ways, but people get really caught up in the difference between, well, this number is 1% lower than that number, and so that is better than what you're doing. And to me, it's like, okay, like you could argue that for sure from some angle, from a purely numeric angle, but the big one that comes up is like input latency. Input latency for me is like, use it. Does it feel fast enough? Then it's good. That's the answer. It doesn't matter what the number is. And I don't mean that, I'm not even saying that for myself. It's for everything. I also, like, we used to have a designer at HashiCorp that was working on some design, and they showed me this design, and I said, I think the padding needs to be a little bit more over here. And he responded saying, oh, but I did that padding because it's perfectly divisible by this padding, and so it like mathematically flows. And I'm like, that doesn't matter at all. Like the mathematical balance of a design doesn't matter. I was like, let's go take 10 people. Company was big enough by then. Let's take 10 people and just ask them A/B which one they want. And I think it was 10 out of 10 that wanted more padding. And I was like, that's the answer. The balance doesn't matter. A design is going to be experienced by a person, and what the person feels is all that matters to a design. So
yeah, that's interesting. I say this so many times, but I always think of this like famous example of the lift going up. Did you know the one where it's like the slow lift?
I'm not sure.
And people complaining about a slow lift. And they were trying to figure out, okay, at this hotel, like, oh, can we speed up the lift? Can we put in another lift or whatever? And then someone said, oh, let's just put a mirror on in the lobby. Yeah. And everyone stopped complaining about the slow lift.
Yep.
And it was like, is it this sort of thing of like, where if people are satisfied, then it's okay?
Yeah, I think we only, this is very philosophical, but it's very deep, I guess, to my lifestyle. It's like we only exist to strive for happiness in our experiences. Like that's my day-to-day sort of mantra. And so whatever I sort of look back and I'm like, what made me less happy? What made me more happy? And just keep optimizing for the branch that makes you more happy, within reason, right? Like that you could actually achieve. And I think that's all that really matters. I think, there's others that strive for perfection in other forms, but to me, I think, human experience will always be number one.
Yeah, it is very cool. And I think that maybe brings us to Ghosty a little bit, in that, like, how did you kind of get onto Ghosty and realize this was the thing that you wanted to do? Because I guess to setting it as well, it's very... and this goes back to, like, I think what we like is about you is like, you're just like, yeah, I'm just going to go build an open source project.
Yeah. I mean, it's a terminal emulator. It's to many people, it's a solved problem. So it's always surprising that I would spend any time working on it. And it's totally understandable. I mean, it's mostly an accident. I think it's a happy accident, but time will tell. But it's mostly an accident. I was still working at HashiCorp at the time, and I had spent 10 plus years building infrastructure automation, primarily server side software, and I was starting to feel just a little bit bored, I guess. Not bored. I didn't feel challenged. I felt like anything that needed to happen in infrastructure, like, I could find a way to make it happen, whether it's good or bad. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, I knew I could solve the problem in some way. And that felt kind of boring to me. So I wanted to challenge myself and do something new, push myself out of the comfort zone. So I took a look at what I was doing at HashiCorp, and I tried to just map the opposites, basically. So I was like, okay, I'm doing server-side software. Let me do desktop software. Okay, I'm using like a memory managed like language. I want to go back to low level like count CPU cycles type of language. And then we're doing all this like API driven input output stuff. Like I'm going to go to graphics programming. I just sort of picked all these opposites. The terminal as a choice was just whatever fit those properties. So the terminal wasn't an opposite of anything, but it was just sort of like, okay, low level systems programming, desktop, graphics. What could I build that actually has all three so I could do all three at once? And I was like, a terminal could do that. It's like, I could try a terminal. So I started working on a terminal. Totally thought that after a few months, I would just like learn something, have a lot of fun, and throw it away. I do that with a ton of projects. Like I have so many private projects on GitHub that never get anywhere, and I throw them away, and that's fine because it was just a learning for fun project. And with the terminal, what ended up happening was I got to a point where I knew enough about all those things that I started looking at other terminals differently and realizing that, well, I felt that they made trade-offs that I didn't think they had to make, or rather that they made trade-offs that I didn't want to trade off. And so I had in mind this terminal that is cross-platform, has a lot of features, is fast, and not only cross-platform, but also feels like it's not. Like I wanted to build a cross-platform software that when you use the Mac version feels like it's only made for Mac. It was optimized for Mac. And when you use it for Linux, feels like it was like made for Linux and or whatever your environment is in Linux. And it feels like really native. And so, yeah. And so I felt like nothing really ticked those boxes. I felt like I could maybe do it. And that's what led to Ghosty. And I think, we have work to do, but I think for the most part that for me, that's become a reality as somebody who uses it daily in Mac and Linux.
Yeah, it's very cool, and I've been using it. It's really cool. It's really, really nice. I thought it was kind of interesting that you called it technical philanthropy, which is like a really cool. I don't know if you coined that term.
I don't know.
It's pretty cool. I
didn't source it from anywhere, but yeah, it's sort of it's just this idea. Technical philanthropy to me is this idea that I'm going to spend some time programming anyway because it's my passion. Like I'm going to do it no matter what. Can I make what I work on and make my time spent benefit some sort of social good? And to me, the social good here is that not almost, but a lot of engineers, like a lot use a terminal every single day. And they're all pretty much free already, but if I could still make that experience a little bit better for them, and I could also give it away for free, then I could maybe make a lot of people's daily work life a little bit better. And that's sort of the social good that I'm sort of aiming for with this.
Yeah, it was really cool. And I know you've also donated money to Zig and stuff like that. And it's
right. So there's also other types of philanthropy I do. That's philanthropy. That's like financial philanthropy aimed at technical products, but not technical philanthropy the way I define it. But yeah, I mean, my family is engaged in a lot of philanthropy, not just to technical projects. We do a bunch of stuff in our community, stuff more globally, but we tend not to talk about it too much. But it's, I think, no matter what I do, that's not my passion, right? Like I don't want to spend all day pursuing those social causes. Like that's why we donate sort of the money, because that's a way for us to sort of make an impact without me having to spend so much time on those social causes. But where I really do want to spend time is programming. And so that's the balance.
I think it's really cool. And it's like like kind of rogue question, but everyone talks about like open source sustainability, but do you think like kind of if people donated more to like exited founders donated more to like technical projects, do you think that could be one of the ways to kind of make it more sustainable?
Maybe. I think my opinion on sustainability is that word is a really strong ideal, but it's a really high bar, because sustainability means that I don't know the exact definition, but to me, sustainability means that it fully sort of funds somebody working full time on that project. Like at least one, like the project itself is fully self-sustained. And I think that bar is so high. I think that for a lot of open source projects, having, I don't know what the right word is, but having at least some compensation for time is more realistic. So I guess like, what I spend a lot of time thinking about is with something like Ghosty is I want it to be sustainable long term, but that's a really high bar. So in the short term, is there a way, outside of me, I should say, should be sustainable outside of me.
Yeah.
And in the short term, is there a way for me to at least, there's a few sort of core type contributors. Is there a way for me to allow them to bill a certain number of hours at a certain rate per month? It's certainly not a living wage. It's not enough to be sustainable for them, but it's a show of appreciation and compensation for their time. The best description I've heard is that a lot of the people that do this sort of contribution are older, have kids, and every hour they spend of every day is a trade-off between who they spend it with and what they're doing. And if they could convince their partner or something that, hey, I spend a couple hours playing around with this project every night, but at least it's
a vacation
allowing us to do this. Yeah, it's not total free time, right? Like I'm not totally just like giving away my time. I'm sort of more interested in that bar to get started because I think it's applicable to so many more projects. I think the sustainability bar is critical for projects like, I don't know, like the kernel, FFmpeg, curl, these core technologies, but there's so many non-core open source projects out there that I can't foresee somebody being paid a competitive salary, even one person to work on it full time, that I'd rather just show appreciation.
Yeah, true. Because it's like when you actually think about where you draw the line on that, it's like could be so many projects.
Yeah.
Okay, and then so on Ghosty as well. So one of the things that you've written a lot about is like kind of how you take on large technical projects, and you wrote this really interesting article about like how you do it. Because speaking from my own experience, it can be really easy to just get like as soon as you start thinking about it too much, like it could be easy to just like get overwhelmed or start it and then like never really get anywhere with it, throw it away, that sort of thing. And your article is really interesting.
Yeah, that's that, for me, it comes from personal experience where one thing I learned really quickly about myself when I was a teenager was that if I took on too big of a challenge, that I would become demotivated and never complete it. Or the inverse is actually what I realized more. The inverse was that I realized when I achieved something, I got a huge amount of satisfaction in that. Call it a dopamine hit or whatever you want, but I got a huge amount of satisfaction in that. So I started thinking, what if I broke down my projects better so that I had multiple moments where I was having that sort of achievement moment where I would feel happy and it would push me to the next thing, And so what I tried to write about is I feel like a lot of people, look at large projects, like a large one, like take a web browser, for example, and think that they can never do it. Like it's an unachievable thing that somehow someone has done. And to me, I've taken the opposite approach, which is I look at something like a web browser and I think, it's made by people. I'm people, so I could do it, right? Like that's how I look at things, and not just, I don't look at that just with tech. I look at that with like a desk. When I look at a desk, I'm like, that was made by a person, and I'm a person, so I could build a desk. Like everything is sort of that sort of pattern, and it just, you can't make it easily. Like it's going to require effort and time and learning and things like that. But you could do it, and so I wrote that. From a technical perspective, since that's where my expertise is how I break down these large projects in order to make them tractable for anybody to achieve.
Yeah, and I think there was some kind of like practical, interesting parts about it as well. Like you were talking about like maybe writing tests and stuff like that at the beginning.
Yeah, there's all sorts of things. I mean, I think the most important thing in terms of these instant gratification is get something that you could iterate on as quickly as possible. So for me, it's like get the project compiling, get the test working, and then write something that breaks it. And the point isn't to make something work. The point is to make something break, to show that you're influencing it in some way. And then from there, you know that you're in it. You're making change. You're making something happen. You just, at the moment you're making a crash or something, but you're making something happen. And then you could go from there.
Yeah.
And web browsers are still very intimidating, but in my experience working on the terminal emulator, my biggest source of education was probably reading the Chrome and Firefox source code, because they are sort of they've solved all of the text rendering problems that terminal has to solve. And so anytime a text rendering problem came up, the first place I would go was the browsers, because they're cross-platform. They render text in every imaginable configuration. So yeah.
Yeah. And do you have like any kind of, I don't know, tips and like getting into those kind of like really big projects? I think you've spoken about contributing to them, your process.
I mean, it matters what you're trying to get into. If you're just trying to learn how they work, then I think my blog post kind of covers it well. And I don't know if we need to get into that detail, but if you're trying to contribute, I think it's a higher bar. So I would say focus on like understanding something. I guess a tip is that you don't need to understand everything if you want to contribute. That is something I see people get caught up on. With a project like a browser, I'm not sure how many people in the world understand the entire Chromium source code. Like, it could be a 0. I suspect it's less than 10. But that's the thing, is you're not going to probably be one of those 10 without spending years and years on the project. So if you're trying to fix, in any project, if you're trying to fix a bug that's in a certain subsystem of the project, then just learn just enough to understand that subsystem, and then make the contribution. I think in my experience as an open source maintainer, I sort of view part of my job in patch review is understanding the larger ramifications of a localized patch. So when someone comes and says, hey, I made this feature work, and I look at it, and it's my job to say, you did make the feature work, but you're going to break these other 3 things that you didn't think about. And also, like, our roadmap has a conflicting feature on it. It's like, it's my job to have the bigger scope than a contributor. I would recommend don't worry about that so much. But on the flip side, don't take too much offense if, your patch gets rejected because you didn't have the bigger picture.
Yeah. Yeah. How have you, with Ghosty, been kind of like, thinking about like the big picture of like what you're trying to build, and kind of making, I guess, the branching decisions, especially?
Yeah. I mean, I think I've tried to document our important design decisions online so that people could understand our trade-offs of what we find important and what we don't find important. I've tried to document a little bit of the roadmap with the idea behind libghostty, which is an embeddable version of a terminal. And I think, with that in mind, I look at pull requests, or I look at feature requests and issues with that in mind. So I think a good example is there's a lot of people that have some sort of angst that Ghosty uses GTK on Linux, and because it uses GTK, it doesn't look quite right on Qt-based platforms like KDE. There's a certain amount we could do to make that better, and we're trying to make that better. But also, if you read sort of our intentions and our goals, then I think that that's something where I'm not sure it's in scope for what Ghosty's trying to achieve, but it's 100% in scope for what libghosty's trying to achieve. So, like, there's an answer. It just may not be the one you want to hear, but I think that's how I think about it. That's my job for this project, and I think that's the hardest part about open source in general, on both sides. When you're a user, you just want everything your way, and when you're a maintainer, it sucks to say no to things, but and people give you shit for saying no to things, but you can't say yes to everything.
Yeah. Is there like any kind of good ways to say no? I guess it's just talking about the bigger. You mentioned there about like, or at least talking about libghosty, for instance.
Yeah, I think what I try to do is I try to show appreciation for them engaging in whatever way they've engaged, and then offer an alternative option. I think that's the best I could do. That sometimes reacts in a negative way. Depending how negative it is, I'll I'll either shut them down or disengage. My view on sort of negative interactions is that I do genuinely try to engage. I try to engage genuinely with everybody, even if it's critical feedback. But if the feedback reaches a point where you're being rude about it, then I'm gonna start playing with you too. Like I'm gonna start having fun with this too. So that's sort of like how I go about things, and that's a little bit different because when I worked for a business, when I did my company, I would never do that because you sort of have corporate interests and financial interests. But like, I'm literally doing this project for fun. So if someone wants to disagree with me, awesome. I love talking to people like that. But if someone wants to disagree with me and then call names or say something rude or insulting, then that's the game we're going to start playing. So that's how I play it.
That's so funny. Yeah, I really thought you were going to say like, I'll disengage, but you're like, no, I'm coming back.
Let's just play around. Yeah, like it just turns into a game at that point. It's not. We're like, because I think the more concrete thing here is if they're not being genuine in their interest in making something better, then it's not. The end goal is that they're just trying to be rude. Like they're being mean for the sake of being mean at this point. They're not being mean for the sake of getting something out of it. And so those people, I have sort of enough experience through my career dealing with people like that I know that it's sort of non-recoverable at that point. So I might as well just have fun with it.
Yeah. That's very cool. You mentioned libghosty a little bit. I thought it was kind of interesting. I think you talk in your docs that like Ghosty is like a reference project that uses libghosty. Which I thought was really interesting.
That's exactly right. I think right now a lot of people who care talk about Ghosty, but I think that long term Ghosty becomes so much less important and becomes almost just a demo of what libghosty is capable of. libghosty is not vaporware. It's the Mac OS Ghosty app today is literally a libghosty consumer. The Mac OS app is a Xcode project. The main entry point is Swift. It's a lot of lines of Swift, and we interact with Ghosty through a C API. Ghosty's written in Zig, but we interact with it through a C API. We compile and link a static libghosty library. Like it's fully libghosty. And the idea is basically that there's so much work in building a good user experience on the front end that we should allow people building terminal-like functionality to focus on that aspect of it and not have to reinvent the wheel for the core part. And then the secondary benefit, but equally important, is that it makes the feature support of terminals everywhere much more rich. If Ghosty continues to be very feature rich and implement all the modern specifications and things like that. So I think a really sort of good example of that's out of scope for something like Ghosty, but a great use case for libghosty is like iOS type stuff or Android too to a certain extent. But like, for example, on iOS, no one's working full time in iOS. You're not editing, code that much in iOS. What people really use iOS terminals for are SSH clients, quickly getting things done through SSH, not spending a ton of time in it. That's the predominant use case. And so you really want to focus on making that SSH experience really good for people. So, you save credentials, you save computer addresses, in one click you're SSH'd in, keep the connection open in the background, all that sort of stuff, right? And that's stuff that I don't want to solve with Ghosty. That's stuff I don't want to build into the desktop applications because it's not that important. But it's a lot of work. And so for someone to have to do that plus build a full terminal emulator is asking a lot. So if I could give them the terminal emulator and then you could spend like 95% of your time actually building the front end, then I think terminals are going to be better for everyone. Right now, the way it sort of works is there are a few SSH terminals on iOS, and honestly, the core terminal emulation is fairly antiquated or feature poor, I would say. You get SSH, you get things like running commands, you do get Vim to a certain extent, but any advanced features you don't really get, and it sort of sucks that you have to make that trade-off. So, yeah.
Yeah, wow. Like, I'm actually struggling to even imagine like using Vim on an iPhone.
Yeah, no, on an iPhone, I don't think anyone is, but I know there's a lot of people.
Okay, iPad.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that use an iPad with a keyboard to I don't know how much they're working, but to do some stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess it's like it's almost like it's dog fooding in a sense, right? Like, I guess you if you'd have just set out to build libghosty, it probably wouldn't be as good as it is because you're facing all these like difficulties head on.
Yeah. So I'm learning dog fooding is a really important part. And the other part is sort of the chicken and egg platform problem. One of the biggest parts about building a platform is that a platform is only as good as the things that build on top of it. If I built libghosty and launched libghosty and nobody ever used libghosty, then it might have been valuable for me to learn. I learned something, I had fun doing it, but ultimately at the end of the day, it provided no value beyond that, right? Like its existence had zero effect on anybody besides myself. And that could be fine. Like for me, that's actually pretty satisfactory, but I hope that Ghosty could do more than that. And so libghosty for me, Ghosty, the applications, the reference implementations are not just dog fooding, but it's also getting people interested in the capabilities of what this thing could do, and hopefully inspiring them to use libghosty versus something else.
Yeah. It's very, very cool. Mitchell, I didn't put it down there, but one of the things I was thinking is it'd be interesting to ask you about, I know this is like almost cliche, but AI stuff, just because it's the thing that everyone is thinking about, like the kind of future of programming.
Yep.
And I just wondered if you would be interested in like talking a little bit about like how you see things, kind of like the role of programmers in the future, and kind of like
That's a really big question, and I don't know if I'm an
Yeah.
expert enough to answer that whole thing. I'm happy to share my personal opinions.
Well, I guess maybe is like one part of it is like why you're working on Ghosty, and it's like it's not like a at least it's not like an AI kind of project, I guess, is like,
yeah,
in that sense is like kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think there's more than enough people working on AI. I think it's quite saturated, but it's also just where my interests lie. I'm a happy consumer of AI tooling, but I really have zero interest in learning more about or pursuing AI as a developer, to the point where even with Ghosty, I've said that I think AI does have a big part to play in terminal interactions, but I want to enable that through plugins rather than me building it myself. Part of that is now it's moving so fast and people have such strong opinions about whether they like it or not, but whether also between what sort of AI tooling they want to use, that I hope that a plugin system will help give them ultimate choice about that. But another part of it is I don't want to work on it. So yeah, that's sort of part of it. It's like, I think it's very consistent. It's just chasing fun.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes total sense. And like, do you have a view on like if people are still going to be like, hiring programmers in X amount of years and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my opinion on that is that I'm not a historian, but at all. But it just seems like there's never been any sort of productivity tool that has resulted in less work to do. I feel like as people become more efficient at one thing, they either invent or discover other things to now spend their time working on. But the flip side of that is that innovation definitely kills the need for specific types of roles. So for example, like if you moved from coal-based energy to nuclear energy, then obviously mining coal is no longer a job that exists. And that's fine. I mean, that's important to understand, because I think in the context of AI, my view is I think AI will do a lot more tasks for what programmers do today. And so the job doing those tasks will disappear, but the need for engineering mindsets in other categories will only increase. So it's more about thinking, not my job is gone, but what does my job change into so that I could become that next person? And so, yeah, I mean, AI today is not there, right? But who knows? I mean, it's already. I've never been an AI doomer. I'm not an AI hype man either. I think it's valuable. I think every programmer should be using AI tooling today, is my opinion. I think it's extremely suspicious when a good engineer, any engineer, I think it's extremely suspicious when any software engineer says, "Oh, I don't use AI tooling." I just think it's like, why? Like it just helps. It just helps, and so it's not a panic. The usual reaction I get from those people is that they tried it and they tried to make it write a program and it was like totally dumb, and like it's so extreme, right? Like you don't need to have AI be this artificial general intelligence. Like AI to me right now is like a very valuable autocomplete, but I'm still doing a lot of creative work. And so that to me is why it's worth it. But yeah.
What tools are you using, by the way?
A mixture of Copilot and ChatGPT and Claude.
Okay.
Are my go-tos. Yeah. I mean, I'm still, I think I know enough about AI to be extremely suspicious of it. But in every single scenario, AI is my first line of action. So if I have someone opens an issue and says, "Can you do this?" I try to think of a concrete example. Like, can you make the underlines in text like split the descenders of like Y's or something? The first thing I'm going to do is just go ask Claude or ChatGPT and just say, given I have a text renderer with these features and I want to do this, how would you solve it? And like kind of have a conversation with it. It's going to generate a lot of garbage, but what it does for me is it starts giving me direction to start doing more trustworthy research on. And so, yeah, it solves a lot of problems. Sometimes you get really lucky. There's a feature in Ghosty where you could customize the Mac OS icon. And that code was almost completely generated by ChatGPT. It was totally broken, but it got the core ideas all right. And so I just had to like fix the APIs that didn't exist that it was calling and make them real APIs. But the actual like order and what it was, the image manipulation algorithms that it was using and everything like that was all right. So the macOS icon customization was never supposed to make it in for 1.0. I think I got the layers for that like 5 days before the 1.0 release. And I was like, I'm never going to do it. And I was able to build that feature in 4 hours because ChatGPT spit out like 200 lines of Swift that every single line didn't compile, but every single line was directionally right. And I just had to like fix up each line to compile. And as I got it to compile, it worked. And I was like, well, I guess that makes it, right? Like, I think that is the strongest example of something saving me. It probably saved me like a few days worth of work.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is super cool.
Yeah.
Are there any other developer tools that you're excited about right now? Not necessarily AI.
I mean, I think it's in the bubble that I'm in, but I'm super excited about the sort of, I don't know, the swell of editor innovation that's happening again. It's certainly not mainstream yet, but there's a venture-backed company out there called Zed building a text editor that I think is really interesting. There's open source projects like Helix that are, not a company, that are working on new editors. There's others, but I just think all that stuff in my opinion, we're in the dystopian homogeny of Visual Studio Code right now. And it feels bad to me. I think it's a pretty subpar tool. And so, I'm just excited for people to just explore and see what can an editor be again.
Very cool. To make it fun again.
Maybe. I mean, even if we decide at the end of it that no, actually VS Code is the best tool for most people, that's fine. The thing that bothers me the most is when stuff happens and so basically all innovation stops in that thing because one mega player emerges. Like, that's the saddest thing to me, because it's the unknowns that bother me the most. It's like the what ifs.
Yeah. I guess the extensions and stuff like that kind of locked it in a little bit.
Yeah. That ecosystem. That's the play. That's always the play.
What text editor do you use actually?
I use NeoVim. I've been a Vim user for a long time, and I think I tweeted this actually, but they're gonna have to pry NeoVim probably from my like cold dead hands, but I'm not saying everyone should use NeoVim, right? Like, I'm just super happy with it, but I could also absolutely respect and admire the work that other editors are doing.
But now I'm suspicious if you actually use it, if you're not telling everyone to use it.
Yeah.
That's awesome. One final question, Mitchell. If you had to like have like one kind of piece of kind of advice that you would give short advice to like a founder of a dev tool, if there was like one thing that they should take away from your experiences.
One thing, I mean, I think obviously I'm so biased, but the one thing I think I would tell all dev tool founders to chase that human experience would be the one thing. I think that it'll be your biggest marketing tool over anything else that you ever do, is if someone uses your product and finds enough joy in it to talk about it to another person, and figuring out what sparks that joy. And it might be that it has to work really well. It might be that it has to be really fast, whatever it is, but that should be the driving force, is to chase the human experience. And I just feel like there's so much we've reversed back into, I'm sort of pessimistic about, we've reversed back into a lot of dev tooling feeling like it's more computer friendly than it is human friendly. And it's bothering me a lot.
Interesting. Well, how does it become more computer friendly than human friendly?
I like when there's a concrete example, for example, is when there aren't sane defaults for something. When the expectation of using software is that you're going to either configure it a ton, or that you're going to specify the right 40 command line flags or the right, YAML keys or whatever. Like I think it really, I guess based on my background, a really strong example for me was the rise of Kubernetes. The rise of Kubernetes really sort of, I don't know, it really kind of deflated me on the human experience side, because Kubernetes itself as a technical project, fine. Like it solves a real problem, totally fine. But like there's probably someone I'm insulting when I say this, and I'm so sorry, but like the complete lack of taste in the YAML description drives me crazy. And that's the biggest thing. What happens once you submit the YAML? Awesome, fun, great. But programming YAML and like getting the right indentation and the right keys, and like there were so many keys that I felt like every one of my deployments, no matter what, not literally a deployment resource, but whatever I was deploying, every one of the things I was deploying, whether it was a mail server or a website or a backend service, like I felt like 50% of it, and probably more, but I'm really like softballing it, 50% of it was identical. And the fact that I had to know what those did and keep doing it, and then the sort of insult to injury for me was then introducing Jinja templating on top of YAML as a way to make them more reusable. Obviously, that's sort of a dig at Helm, but there's other projects that did it as well. It feels bad. It feels that it is sort of mean, but the best word I could use, that the reason it hurts me is taste. It just feels distasteful. It's not functionally totally works fine. There's technical design decisions that are completely defensible, but it's sort of, it's sort of like going to a restaurant and getting served something that saying like, well, it's going to make you full and it's going to taste okay, but you got to like put it together yourself. It's like, come on, like we could do better than this. Yeah.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's that thinking about like the human, not just it does the job, but it
And I hope no one takes away from this that I'm perfect at this. I'm far from perfect at this. I think it's like it's a learning experience where I've made and continue to make tons of mistakes, but I think the intention behind trying to spark that joy in the human experience, that's more important to me. If someone tries and fails, that's totally fine. But I just feel like there's a lack of trying right now.
Yeah, it's actually really, really interesting that I recently spoke to Taylor Otwell, you, and Guillermo, three of like the most successful DevTools people, and you all said taste was like one of the key things. And it's
well, of those two people that you mentioned, I think do an excellent job. I think that they're leading the charge for sure in that category.
Taste is a powerful thing. Mitchell, sorry, I realized we're at time, but yeah, thank you so much. That was really awesome. If there's, I guess you haven't really got anything to plug, but if you
no,
Ghosty,
I mean, if you care, if you care, it's not that important to me. I mean, I think that I'm out here trying to have fun, and I hope people got something interesting out of this, even if you disagree. I mean, I hope it was interesting, and that's good for me. Thanks for having me on.